Good morning, everyone. Happy Halloween. Thanks for joining us on the start of week 2 of the WACAP conference. It's my pleasure to introduce to you all Dr. Chan Hellman. He is a professor at the University of Oklahoma and comes to us from Oklahoma. He does a lot of research and background into hope and the science of hope. And one of the really intriguing things about Dr. Hellman is that he's been working throughout the country on this idea of bringing a hope-centered practice to child welfare. I've met him through some of the work that I've been doing at the state court level, kind of rolling this out. And so many of you may be familiar with this idea of introducing hope into our case planning and into our expectations and just overall interactions in dealing with families. And so I'm bringing it to you all so that you have an understanding of what is going on across the state, and hopefully you can start to incorporate some of these principles into your practice when working with parents and families, and quite frankly, even the other professionals on the case. So, Dr. Hellman, the stage is yours. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Ryan, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of your conference and training. And as Ryan mentioned, my name is Chan Hellman. I'm a professor in the School of Social Work at the University of Oklahoma. For about the last 20 years, I've been focused on my research and efforts in the areas of domestic violence, child maltreatment, food insecurity, homelessness, primarily evaluating the impact and outcomes of program services. Here in Oklahoma, I've actually worked closely with our statewide CASA organization, as well as several community-based CASA organizations, and have evaluated the impact there with regards to impact on children, and especially advocates as drivers of hope for children being served in these circumstances. Again, as Ryan indicated, in the state of Washington, there's a concerted effort to move towards a hope-centered framework within the court systems. I've also been working very closely with the Office for State Public Instruction, OSPI, moving it into multiple school districts around the state. We have been training the judicial team members from the Supreme Court, the appellate courts, all the way across the state. And so it's really an honor to get to share this information with you, especially those in the process of being really on the front lines of working with children who are experiencing a lot of uncertainty, unpredictability, as well as adversity and trauma. So today what I'm going to do is give a PowerPoint presentation around the science of hope. And then when I finish with that, we'll take a little bit of a break. We'll just take a few minutes for you to get some time to stretch your legs or whatever. And then when we come back, it'll be fairly interactive, and I'll show you the strategies that we actually have developed, the processes that have been shown to nurture and restore hope for children, for adults, and for families. So I want to give you a little bit of interactive strategy, some actual takeaways, things that you can do and begin to start implementing today in this process of generating hope-centered practices. I will tell you that before I get started, a couple of things. This work is taking place across the United States. I've worked with the court systems in the state of Mississippi. Every judge in the state of Mississippi has been through this training. Oklahoma, California. We're starting to work in Iowa, and I've also been working in Virginia. So the science of hope is something that is gaining traction. And so again, it's a pleasure and an honor to get to spend some time with you today. Because we're a relatively small group, I think it'll also offer us an opportunity both before the worksheets or before the processes as well as after, to potentially do a little Q&A. If you have questions or comments or reflections, it may give us an opportunity to go a little bit deeper if you have some questions or comments. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get us started on the science of hope. I will tell you that I'm driven by basically three areas of focus. So from a research perspective, I'm really interested in hope in the context of trauma and adversity. So the first question that I really pay a lot of attention to is, what are the outcomes of hope? When we're able to nurture hope, what does that help produce? The second question, which is where most of our publication or research publications lie, is under the question of how does trauma and adversity rob us of that capacity for hope? And then the final question is really focused on what are the simple strategies that we can begin to integrate into practice that nurture and restore hope for children, for adults, and families. So as part of our work in developing curriculum and strategies, it has been very important to us to develop these strategies that are accessible to everyone, to parents, to CASA advocates, to coaches, to teachers, counselors, youth ministers, because we believe that everybody has a role to play in nurturing hope, especially in children and families. So that's really been the focus of that work. Now, I will tell you that I've only been doing work around this concept of hope for the last 15 years. And so I want to start off by talking a little bit about how I was introduced to this concept of hope. Now, my professional background is as a psychologist. My doctoral studies are in the field of psychology. And roughly 15 years ago, I was asked to do a housing needs assessment for an organization that provides services to those living with HIV and AIDS. This is an organization that also serves individuals experiencing very extreme poverty and other forms of adversity. So a vast majority of the clients are making daily decisions around survival, such as housing, nutrition, access to healthcare, et cetera. And as part of doing this needs assessment, I was fortunate enough to be introduced to a young man named David. And one of the things that I try to do at every presentation is to give a little bit of honor to this young man, David, because he's really the one responsible for introducing me to this concept of hope. So it turns out that David was 19. He was a client receiving services at this organization. He had just turned 19 years old. And as he and I were having a brief conversation, he shared with me that 3 months earlier, he learned that he was HIV positive. As he shared that with me, the first thing that came to my mind as a psychologist is this concept of what is wrong with you. Now, what I'm going to argue is that when we are doing work with individuals who are experiencing adversity and trauma, whether that's children, adolescents, adults, or families, that when they experience adversity, we are traditionally trained to focus on this idea of what must be wrong. Given the adversity, what are they experiencing? So this is the traditional lens that guides our work. Now, as I continue to have this conversation with David, he further shared with me that 2 weeks earlier, he had disclosed to his parents that he was HIV positive, and they'd kicked him out of the house. So he had spent the last 2 weeks homeless in downtown Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is where I'm from. Now, as David is sharing all of this adversity with me, I'm really paying attention to looking for things like depression, anxiety, social isolation, emotional dysregulation, for instance, his experiencing anger and sadness at a much higher rate than joy and contentment. And so as I'm listening for these things, and by the way, it is this framework that helps guide our action, this "what's wrong with you" framework. So as I'm listening to this experience by David, he begins to shift the conversation. David shared with me that during this time of being homeless, he had actually been to the local community college. He had made an appointment with an academic counselor that while he was experiencing homelessness, he had enrolled in his first semester of college, declaring a major and navigating that entire process, all while also in the context of survival. And so it occurred to me in this moment that I'd spent my entire professional career focused on this question of what is wrong. And what I learned from David is there may be a better question. There may be another framework by which to do this work. And that is trying to understand what is right with you. So the idea is not to ignore the adversity. I'm not arguing at all. So throughout this workshop, I'm not arguing that hope is the power of positive thinking. I'm not suggesting that we just ignore the adversity. What I'm suggesting is that while we're working in that space of adversity, that we do it from a lens of hope, this idea that we have an opportunity to identify the strengths and to nurture those strengths as a framework to working towards well-being. The second thing that I want to share with you throughout this entire presentation is that for all of the work that we're going to talk about, hope is not the outcome. Hope is the framework. And well-being is always the outcome that we're working towards, whether that's the well-being of children, the well-being of adults, the well-being of families, the well-being of volunteers who are day in and day out focused on the adversity and trauma of others. So how do we create hope-centered processes that nurture well-being? Now, one of the things that I enjoy about working in the state of Washington is that you all are about 20 years ahead of the rest of us with regards to your awareness and understanding of such things like the adverse childhood experiences. As I work in Oklahoma, for instance, we still have dramatic gaps in the awareness and understanding of this. Now, I don't intend to spend much time here, but I do want to show you where we've been focusing our work in doing hope-centered strategies with children, adults, and families in these high trauma, high stress scenarios. So you're all familiar, my guess is you're familiar with the adverse childhood experiences, at least the original aspect of it, which are these 10 categories, these 10 adversities. And then you're also familiar with, number one, the prevalence of these in our communities, but also the long-term consequences and the dosage effect that is associated with those. By the way, in Oklahoma, we rank number one in the nation with children exposed to 2 or more of these adversities. So this is really starting to gain traction in the state of Oklahoma. But again, we are really looking to states like Washington because you've been doing this so much longer than we have. So this is the Center for Disease Control's latest report on the prevalence of the adverse childhood experience in the United States. And as this report, these studies are very consistent, demonstrating that roughly 2/3 of the adult population in the United States have been exposed to one or more of these adversities. What I will ask you to sort of pay attention to here is the average ACE score within that data set. So the average exposure to adversity within the United States is just under 2 out of those 10 adversities. So I want to share with you some of the spaces that we've been doing hope-centered work in this process. And I'll focus predominantly on youth in this space. We certainly are doing work with adults, with families. We're working in prison systems, for instance, et cetera. But I'll focus predominantly on youth. So again, this is the national average. And I've been fortunate enough over the last 10 plus years to be the lead researcher on a Department of Justice funded project to examine children exposed to domestic violence. So this data is based upon roughly 3,000 youth across 26 states, including Washington. And so you can see that children who are exposed to domestic violence have an average ACE score of 4.4, significantly higher than the national average. What this has helped us understand, by the way, is that historically, the federal government has provided funding for programs working with children based upon a single adversity. For example, domestic violence. And what this data has helped us demonstrate and advocate is that children aren't just exposed to domestic violence, that children are in fact polyvictims, oftentimes in these difficult spaces. When we look at the adjudicated youth, youth in our juvenile system, Office Juvenile Affairs, we also see a very high rate of exposure to these forms of adversity. And finally, foster children in the state of Oklahoma. So we're actually partnering with the Oklahoma Department of Human Services, our child welfare system. And this is the average number of adversities that our foster youth have experienced. Now, these are foster youth between the ages of 14 and 17. So again, you can see a high rate of exposure to those adversities. So I'm going to ask you throughout this presentation to use the chat function. And so one of the things that I'll ask you, for instance, in this particular graph, is what would you estimate is the average number of placements that youth who are engaged in the foster care system, what is the average number of placements that you would estimate these children experience? So just type that into the chat function, if you don't mind. Thank you. 6, 5, very good. We'll see if a couple more come up. Very good. Thank you very much for engaging in the chat function. I greatly appreciate that. And so as you are continuing to type in, what I will share with you is that in Oklahoma, for these youth that we're studying, the average number of placements is 22. On average, these children have experienced 22 different placements during their time in foster care. Now, these are not adversities that are captured by the adverse childhood experiences. And so it helps us recognize that, that children are exposed to tremendous other types of adversity during this, this difficult time. Now, personally, I'm not overly interested per se in the adverse childhood experiences. What I am interested in is how the exposure to those adversities influence the way that we communicate and relate to each other. So how does the exposure to things like the adverse childhood experience show up? So how does it show up when parents come into the courtroom for the first time? How does it show up when a child engages with their advocate for the very first time? And so what we focus on are the psychological outcomes or consequences of trauma and adversity. So if you look at the upper left-hand corner of this graph, what you'll see is that children and adults who have an ACE score of 1 or higher report significantly lower levels of trust in professionals. So let me put that more bluntly. They report significantly lower levels of trust in you. Now, if they don't trust you in that initial interaction, how does that influence the way they engage with you, the way they communicate? And so what we have found is that the adverse childhood experience, for instance, actually leads to a significantly higher insecure attachments that children would have relating to lower levels of hope. So this is what I'm much more interested in, is how does the exposure to trauma and adversity influence the way children relate to others, but also the way children engage in program services. And again, these are just a few of those psychological outcomes. So what we know from the adverse childhood experiences, and this, by the way, is taken from conversations and the writings of Vince Folletti, who's the original author of the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And what he and I have had some discussions about is basically the framework that this idea that the trauma experiences that we've had really lead to, or have the potential to lead to, maladaptive coping strategies. So a significant increase in risk-taking behaviors, smoking, drinking, substance use and abuse, sexual behaviors, criminology, etc. And that if we don't find strategies as a community or as a system or as a program to interrupt these maladaptive coping strategies, the long-term consequences lead towards despair. So as a result of learning about adversity, so my guess is that you've all been exposed to trauma awareness training, trauma-informed care types of initiatives. And what we've basically have come to the conclusion is that once a community or an organization becomes more trauma aware, then it leads to the question of, what do we do about it? What do we do about these adversities that are experienced by children? And what I'm going to argue throughout this workshop is that hope is what we do about it. That hope actually provides a framework for action in working with children, with adults and families. So this work has led to the curriculum development that we have in training organizations. And by the way, we have a multi-tiered training program for organizations. And what we're doing today is one of those tiers of training. It is called the Hope Awareness Training that we provide to these organizations. And so again, this is a quote by Vince Folletti, who provided this quote in support of the book that I wrote, Hope Rising. But you can see that the idea is that the science of hope may be the action or the framework that can be used to work with communities experiencing high forms of adversities. All right, so we're now 27 minutes into the presentation, so I'll start talking about hope for really the first time. So I'm going to ask you to use the chat function again. And what I'd like is just as you think about this word hope, what do you associate that with? What comes to mind as you think about this word hope? What are some terms or ideas that you associate with hope? The future. Thank you, Brett. Anticipating that everything will be okay. Very good. Thank you, Annette. We'll see if a couple more pop up. I do have one more question for you. Future will be bright. Very good. Very good. Yeah. Positive psychology field. Very good, Rochelle. Hope is very much part of the positive psychology framework. Very good. Thank you all for engaging in that chat function. So let me ask one more question before I give us the definition. Is hope an emotion? Is it a feeling that you have? Or is hope a way of thinking? Let's just think about that for a moment and just type your answer into the chat function. Is hope an emotion or is it a way of thinking? Great, thank you, Annette. Feeling and tentative way of thinking. Sarah has a feeling. Good, a way of thinking is kind of the dominant response. Good, good, very good. Very good. So what I will tell you is that the way that we're going to talk about hope today in this workshop is that hope is a way of thinking, that hope is a cognitive process. And the reason that this is so important for us to really think about is because if hope was an emotion, if hope was a feeling that we had, then at best, we'd be able to help children manage those feelings, at best. But because hope is a way of thinking, what we know is that hope can be taught. Hope is something that we can teach and restore in children, adults, and families. And just as an example, I've been working with an organization doing hope work with 3-year-olds. And what we have found is that children as young as 3 years old can actually distinguish the concept and the core components of hopeful thinking. So here is the definition that we use. Hope is the belief that the future will be better than today and that we have the power to make it so. So this is our definition. Now, a couple of things about this definition. First and foremost is if you look at the very first part of the definition, hope is the belief that the future will be better than today. If we stop there, that's optimism. That is an optimistic expectation that the future will be better. Hope goes beyond optimism. Hope goes beyond optimism through the latter part of the definition, that we have the power to make it so. So in this way, hope is about taking action to pursue that future. Now, one of the things that I really enjoy about the concept of hope is the simplicity. That hope is based upon these 3 basic ideas: goals, pathway, and willpower. So first, let's talk about goals. Goals are the cornerstone of everything we do with hope. Goals drive everything. Now, the idea is that for each and every one of us, from the moment we wake up until the moment we go to bed, we are pursuing goals in our life. Each and every one of us are goal driven, whether in the short term or long term. But that is the nature of the human experience, is to be goal driven. The question with hope is whether or not we have the ability to identify or to gain access to those pathways that lead to goal attainment. Pathways thinking is our ability to identify the roadmap that we're going to use to get there from here. Pathways thinking also includes the problem-solving process. That is the ability to identify barriers and to begin the problem-solving strategy to overcome those barriers or to find alternative pathways. So in short, pathways thinking is the strategizing piece of hope, the strategizing way in which we're going to pursue and attain the goals. The final part of hope is this concept of willpower. Willpower is the mental energy that each and every one of us have to dedicate to those pathway pursuits. So willpower is really the motivational piece of hope. Do I have the energy to engage in those pathways? Am I able to focus my attention and intention on those pathway pursuits? So goals, pathways, and willpower, those are the three core components of hope. And this is why, for me, hope is a framework for action, because it helps us focus on three simple issues when working with children, with adults, and with families. So if a child, for instance, makes a future-oriented statement like, I want to play with my friends or be able to go to a basketball game at my school, those are future expectations. And what we know when we hear a future expectation is that it is time for us to engage in pathways thinking with that youth. So this is how we use the framework of hope. Now, one of the things that's really important is for us to recognize that in order to nurture hope, we have to have both willpower and way power towards our goals. So it might be that, for instance, we are highly motivated. We have a lot of energy towards a goal. There's a lot of desire and a lot of focusing of our attention on those goals. But if we don't know how to get there from here, if we don't have the pathways, this is what we refer to as lower hope. Now, alternatively, it may be that we have the pathways, but we're not motivated, or we just don't have the energy to use to engage in those pathways. So imagine a middle school age child who's laying their head down on the desk in the classroom. And we might think, you know, if they would just study, if they just read the chapters, if they join a study group, if they'd work with a tutor, all of which are pathways to getting good grades. But if that child isn't motivated, doesn't have the mental energy to do that work, we would actually classify that as lower hope. So I'm getting ready to ask you to use the chat function again. So just a little bit of a heads up, but there are two really important takeaways from this graph that I want to share. So 15 years ago, when I first was introduced to this concept of hope, when I started to think about this graph, this goals, pathways, willpower, the first thing that came to my mind was that I think this language of hope actually describes the important work that each and every one of you are doing day in and day out. I think CASA is a pathway of hope for children. I think CASA volunteers are pathways of hope for each child that they work with. So I think this language of hope is one of the best descriptions of the work that you do. The hard part, of course, is the willpower piece. So As you start to think about during this workshop, this idea of how do I do hope, or is hope one more thing that I get to do or that we're going to be required to do, the first thing I'd like for you to consider is that hope is a mindset. And I think that hope actually describes much of the work that you're already doing. And interestingly enough, there are 2,000 published research studies that demonstrate that hope is one of the strongest predictors of our well-being for children, for adults, and for families. So not only does the language of hope provide a description of the work that you already do, but the science of hope actually provides the robust body of science that demonstrates that what you do is highly effective at promoting well-being for children. So that's the first kind of big takeaway in this particular graph. And here's where I'm going to ask you to use the chat function. So for instance, let's think about how we use the word hope in our everyday conversation. So what are some common phrases that you might use with somebody else where we use the word hope? So for instance, if Ryan and I are having conversation, what would be some common phrases where we use the word hope? And I'll just ask you to use the chat function again, if you don't mind. Great. Thank you, Daisy. Thank you, Santana. Skylar. Great. So all of these are wonderful. I hope you feel better. I hope you have a great day. I hope we have good weather today. I actually love that during this training. I actually talked quite a bit about being from Oklahoma. And one of the things that we commonly will say are things like, I hope there are no tornadoes today. So my goal, of course, is that there are no severe storms. And I have a lot of willpower towards that. When storms come to Oklahoma, my energy level greatly elevates. Now, while I have a lot of willpower towards the goal of no thunderstorms or severe storms, I have absolutely no pathways. I have no control over the weather. And so at this point in learning about the science of hope, what I want us to really lean into is the distinction between hoping and wishing. So wishing is when we have a desire for a particular outcome, but we have no pathways. So in this way, wishing is passive towards the goal. I have the desire, but there's nothing to do. There's nothing I can do, or I have no control over the outcomes. And so we have to be able to distinguish hoping from wishing, because hope is about taking action to pursue those goals. So if a child, for instance, tells us that they want to go back home, but the court system has mandated that they be involved in this process of evaluating, this idea of wanting to go home is not as much about hope. It's more about wishing. And so what we can do in those spaces is to focus on the things that the child actually has control over. So we shift and set those short-term goals where we can begin to nurture hope. Now I want to spend just a second, or a few minutes rather, talking about how trauma and adversity influence goals, pathways, and willpower. So first is the way adversity influences the nature of our goals. So what we've learned is that when children and adults are in the presence of adversity, we are much more likely to set avoidant goals. That is, we're more likely to set goals around outcomes that we do not want to occur. However, when we nurture and restore that hope, what we see is a transition towards achievement. Now, let me tell you why this is so important, because it's the nature of our goals that drive the pathways that we can determine to pursue those goals. So let's use this example. Imagine a basketball player that steps out on the court and their mindset is that I want to get the ball and shoot the winning shot for the team. This is an achievement mindset. Now imagine the same basketball player that steps out on the court and the mindset is, I hope they don't throw me the ball because I'm probably going to lose it and really disappoint my team. This is an avoidant mindset. What I'd like for you to consider is the way those two basketball players behave on the court. So you can see that the achievement-oriented player is doing everything they can to get open, to get to the ball. Whereas the avoidant mindset is doing everything they can to stay away from the ball. So the nature of the goals become really important in us doing hope-centered work. And so what we've also found is that we are much better at short-term goal setting than long-term goal setting. So when we're in the presence of adversity and stress, focusing on the short term, like goals for today, or maybe even goals for this morning, that is where we are much better at goal setting and pathways development. As I mentioned, during times of adversity, our pathways thinking becomes distressed. This is especially true for children. And what our research has found is, first of all, children have very limited control over their environment anyway. But when you throw in the mix of child maltreatment, the predictability also becomes suspect, thus greatly reducing the development of pathways thinking. And so oftentimes these children will experience the first barrier and shut down or melt down in that scenario. The final piece is the way in which trauma and adversity impact the willpower. And the research here is very important. First and foremost, what this demonstrates is that willpower for each of us is a limited resource, that you and I only have so much mental energy to give day in and day out. And that throughout the course of the day, we are depleting that willpower. So you've each gone home at the end of the day, mentally exhausted. This is what I mean by the depletion of willpower. The problem is that when our willpower is depleted, so too is our ability for self-control, to self-regulate. So we have a much harder time engaging in self-control of our emotions, of our thoughts, and of our behaviors. So a child who has depleted willpower is going to become much more impulsive, for instance. So first takeaway is the fact that willpower is limited. The second big takeaway is that research demonstrates that our willpower is associated with the glucose in our systems. So as you know, glucose for us is sugar, or more importantly, our source of energy. And so what this research shows is that because glucose is associated with willpower, then we know nutrition matters. Making sure that children have access to adequate nutrition becomes an important part of nurturing their hope. So free and reduced lunches, access to snacks, but just activities that also incorporate nutrition become an important component of hope. All right, on this particular slide, I'm gonna ask you to use the chat function as well. And first and foremost, we're gonna do a hypothetical example, and we're gonna demonstrate how goals, pathways, and willpower all interplay in this process of hope. So the first thing that I'd like to ask you to do is to just use the chat function. And what I'd like to know is how many of you know how to drive or have ever attempted to drive a manual transmission vehicle. So just, if you don't mind, just type in the chat whether or not you know how to drive or have ever attempted to drive. Thank you. Thank you, Brett, John. Very good. Very good. Very good. Let's see. Rochelle has said no. I wonder, Rochelle, would you be willing to interact with me on audio in this example? So let's see. Okay, so go ahead and unmute yourself, Rochelle, and we'll just have a little bit of a conversation if you don't mind. So thank you for that.
Can you hear me okay?
I can, thank you.
Great.
So let me ask everybody this question first. Now, Rochelle, have you seen somebody drive a manual transmission vehicle? You've seen that process?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So this is a question for everybody, including you, Rochelle. Can you, in your mind, picture the vehicle that has this manual transmission? Those of you who've driven one before, what I'd like for you to remember is your very first attempt at ever driving that vehicle. But let me just ask, can everybody see in your mind this vehicle? So very good, people are saying yes. Very good. Can you see the clutch, the brake, and the gas pedal on the floor again in your mind? Can you just imagine that? And you can see the gearbox. And then let me just go further. And Rochelle, let me ask you this. Can you picture the vehicle and see the pedals on the floor in your mind?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Can you imagine yourself sitting in the driver's seat of that vehicle? Can you just picture that?
Yes.
Now, even if it's absolutely luck, could you just imagine yourself driving, moving forward in this vehicle?
Yes.
Wonderful, wonderful. So this is the first important principle for nurturing hope, and that is that imagination is the instrument of hope. Okay? Imagination is the instrument of hope. Because if hope is about goal setting, then just setting the goals isn't all of the work. We have to help people cast a vision of what the future will be. And we have to help them see themselves in that future. And that's what nurtures hope. Okay, so Rochelle, we're gonna walk through this hypothetical example together. Now, I'm gonna invite everybody else to play along, to use the chat function. But Rochelle and I are going to do this verbally. So you're going to drive a manual transmission vehicle for the very first time in this hypothetical example. Now, unfortunately, I'm going to put two pieces of adversity into this scenario. So Rochelle, so you're going to drive this vehicle for the very first time. And unfortunately, you're parked facing uphill. Okay, so you're on a fairly steep hill, and so when you drive forward, you've got to go up this hill. Okay.
Okay.
Now, the final piece of adversity is, let's put a brand new BMW vehicle right behind you. Okay. So immediately behind you is this brand new, highly expensive luxury vehicle. Okay.
Okay.
All right, so Rochelle, you've got the car started. You're in first gear. And in just a moment, I'm going to have you imagine that you're going to let the clutch out for the very first time. Now, remember, you're facing uphill and you've got a brand new BMW behind you. So in the moment that you let that clutch out, what is your goal?
To progress forward up the hill.
Great, great.
And get in the correct gear to get up.
So when you think about going uphill, what is the importance of going uphill? in terms of that goal?
Just making progress, I guess, like
Good.
having success actually moving the vehicle correctly forward.
Very good. Very good. So what happens is that oftentimes when we do this scenario and we ask, what is your goal as soon as you let the clutch out, we get two responses. And the first response we typically get is to not roll backwards, to not hit the BMW. And then oftentimes when people say to move forward, they talk about to move forward so they don't hit the BMW. And what I was, the importance of thinking about that is because to not hit the BMW is an avoidant goal. And my point is that for those of us who, when we imagine ourselves driving for the very first time, it is just very natural for us when we're in a high stress environment to go for an avoidant goal. And what I really want to communicate here is that initially having an avoidant goal, there's nothing wrong with that. So imagine this, not hitting the BMW is a good goal, right? We can all agree that that is a good goal. The problem is that it typically comes from a place of fear and uncertainty. So we don't want to stay there. So Rochelle, let's imagine that you let the clutch out for the very first time and you killed the engine. You had a failed attempt at driving this manual transmission vehicle. Now you didn't hit the BMW, but you immediately stalled that engine. Can you imagine what may be going through your mind at regarding your ability to drive a manual transmission vehicle as soon as you stalled that vehicle?
Yeah, the first word that comes to mind is failure.
Yeah. So what we've learned, so thank you for that. What we've learned in our research is that when we have that first failed attempt, we are much more likely to engage in these negative self-talk, like I'm a failure, or I can't do this, I'll never be able to do this. And so this is typically the self-talk of a lower hope scenario. Now, and Rochelle, thank you very much for participating, and I'll walk us through the rest of this hypothetical scenario, but thank you for.
Thank you.
All right, so as we had this first failed attempt, and we're typically filled with the I can't mindset. What I'd like for those of you who know how to drive or attempted to drive, what I'd like for you to consider is, why did you not give up? When you had that first failed attempt at driving a manual transmission vehicle, why didn't you quit? And oftentimes what we learn is that because I wanted to drive, because I desired the goal. And what we found, again, in the research is the more that we desire the goal, the more likely we are to face adversity to overcome it. That is, when we have that failed attempt, we're still going to try to pursue that goal. So let's just keep going with this hypothetical scenario. And for all of us, let's imagine that you start the car back up. You let the clutch out, and this time you lurch forward. You actually move forward. So you're having a success. So we're going to ask you to pull over and turn the vehicle off and start all over because practice makes perfect. So the third time you get into the car, or I'm sorry, that you start the car up and you let the clutch out, you kill the engine again. But what I'd like for you to consider is what's going through your mind now with regards to your ability to drive the vehicle. And typically what we're going to hear is, well, I've done it before, I can do it again. Even if it was luck, I've done it before, I can do it again. And this represents a really important component of hope, which is hope begets hope. Hope begets hope. That the one opportunity for success demonstrated for us the future is possible. So we see a transition from the I can't mentality to the I can. Now, we may still be in an avoidant goal, like don't park on a hill, but the nature of our mindset is slowly starting to shift. And pretty soon, we've all learned to navigate letting the clutch out. And so this becomes the pathways component to this work. Now, the question becomes, how well can you manage your willpower? So think about how much of your mental energy is required the first time you let the clutch out. And the answer is all of it. We have to be able to dedicate all of our mental energy, all of our attention to that process. Whereas today, when we drive, we don't have to focus much of our attention at all. And so here's what I'd like for you to consider for each one of you, because again, I believe that you are all pathways of hope for children. I think CASA is a pathway of hope organization for your communities. And so what we have to think about is the nature of the way we begin to develop pathways when we're working with children or we're designing programs. Because we have to remember that willpower is a limited resource. And when we're in the presence of adversity and stress, our ability to focus our attention on programs is very, very limited. So we have to think about how do we set up early opportunities for success when we're working with children so that they begin to see that the future is possible. So this is a hypothetical example of the three components of hope: goals, pathways, and willpower. All right, so I'll start moving forward a little bit quicker, because what I wanted to introduce to you was the basic components of hope, which is goals, pathways, and willpower. But in this particular slide, what I want to demonstrate for you is just a simple kind of example of the fact that we are naturally future oriented. So what I'd like to challenge you to do is, if you don't mind, take just a moment, close your eyes, and let your mind wander. Now, just real quickly, this is not a mindfulness moment. I'm not asking you to be present. I'm asking you to let your mind wander. And I'll bring us back in just a moment. Okay, so as you were sitting there for this brief period of time, what I'd ask you to consider is whether or not, how much of that time were you thinking about the future? How much of this time, as your mind was wandering, were you thinking about your to-do list and maybe your emails or all of the things that you still have to do today? And then I'd ask you to reflect on whether or not you actually went back to the past, because what this research shows us is that a vast majority of us tend to be future oriented. We tend to spend our time cognitively just thinking about the future, whether it's just in the immediate future or longer future. We tend to be future oriented. A little less frequently, we tend to reflect on the past, and then rarely are we in fact present. Now, unfortunately, what we know from our research is that thinking about the future and reflecting on the past can be both positive and negative. And here's what we found with children, by the way, is that children with an ACE score of 1 or higher tend to spend significantly more time reflecting on the past in rumination. They tend to experience higher rates of rumination, regret, shame, and guilt. And when they think about the future, it is typically through the lens of worry and fear. Now, unfortunately, when we think about the future from the perspective of worry, or we ruminate on the past, we tend to score much higher on indicators of suffering. We tend to score much higher on negative emotions, maladaptive coping, etc. So the nature of the work is, how do we interrupt the suffering? How do we interrupt that process so that we can nurture a future expectation that it will be better. And more importantly, that we have the power to make it so. Because what we found, even in high trauma scenarios, is that when we're able to move the needle on hope, what we see are significant and pronounced gains in flourishing for children, for adults, and families. And these are high trauma environments that literally, when we begin the journey of hope, well-being starts to be influenced. All right, I'm going to ask you to use the chat function again. And this is a graph this is a question that I ask at every presentation that I give. And I'll just ask you to type into the chat function, what do you think the answer is to what is the opposite of hope? Despair. Thank you, Annette. Very good. Very good. And I'll just let those go. And you can see that the majority, if not all, the consensus is despair. Despair is the opposite of hope. Now, what I will tell you is this is the most common response that I get, regardless of where we do this work. So whether it's in the United States, whether it's in the UK, Europe, the Mideast, all the different locations that I've done this training, it is universal that we think the opposite of hope is despair. However, what we know is that the loss of hope is a process, and the opposite of hope is apathy. It's apathy. It's when we give up. It's when a child looks at a possible future through the eyes of, no matter what I do, I'm going to fail. So why try? No matter what I do, they're not going to let me. So why try? Now, if we think about this loss of hope as a process, the first experience when our pathways are blocked is anger, rage, anxiety, frustration. And if we're unable to overcome those barriers, we can transition into despair. Now, despair is still an important part of hope, because with despair, I still have high levels of willpower towards the goal that I have. It's just that my pathways are significantly blocked. Now, the problem with despair is that we tend to experience a sense of urgency. And what I'd like for you to consider as your roles as advocates or within the CASA system is, where have you seen desperation? Because if despair is not navigated, it can lead towards desperation. And I will tell you that when I was training the CASA team here in Oklahoma, when I asked that question, one of the advocates immediately responded and said, when parents abduct a child. And so if we think about that from the lens of hope, the goal is reunification. The goal is to get the children back. Now, by itself, that is a good goal, and the willpower is quite high. However, what we've learned is that when we are in the presence of despair, those pathways are significantly blocked, it can lead us towards desperation. And abducting the child is a very dysfunctional pathway to achieve the goal. And so we have to find strategies to interrupt both despair and apathy. So just real quickly, some of the data that we have. This is Washington's most recent Healthy Youth Survey, where we're able to look at the exposure to adverse childhood experiences and children's hope scores. So these are 8th grade youth in your data, your statewide data. And the blue bar represents 0 ACEs. So you can see that a majority of responding youth, roughly just under 80%, report moderate to high hope. But if you look at the orange bar, you'll see these are children with an ACE score of 1 or higher, and they report significantly lower levels of hope. So we know that the exposure to trauma and adversity rob us of hope. So we also looked at hope and academic achievement in the Healthy Youth Survey. Again, this is Washington data. And what we can see, for instance, is the low hope group, about 53% of them report receiving mostly C's, D's, and F. Whereas the high hope group of youth, only 17% report getting C's, D's, and F's on their report card. So please keep that into context. Children who have been exposed to adversity report lower levels of hope. And we know that hope for youth is a significant predictor of academic achievement. We also know, for instance, that the exposure of adversity can lead youth to a higher rate of suicidal ideation. So here we see, for instance, 45% of the low hope group of youth report suicidal ideation, compared to just under 10% of the high hope group. So we know that hope is related to depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, etc. The good news in all of this is that we know how to nurture hope. We know how to do this process. And we have to remember that hope can be taught. And what I will tell you is that in our training program, what we've learned, especially working with youth, is that we can see significant improvements in hope among high trauma youth in about an hour. In about an hour's worth of efforts, we can see hope scores increase. So just as the loss of hope is a process, nurturing hope is also a process. And remember, goals are the cornerstone. It always starts with goal setting and really incorporating children and families into that process of what are the goals, what do they want to achieve, how are we going to get there? How do we incorporate imagination as the instrument of hope by creating future memories of success? So these are the strategies. When we come back from the break in just a little bit, I'll actually walk us through some of these strategies. What I do want to show you real quickly is how we've actually implemented this with high adversity or high trauma youth. So this is going to be those youth who are exposed to domestic violence. And you can see for each of those ACE categories, the high rate of prevalence of exposure to adversity, 80% domestic violence, 45% with a parent, incarcerated parent, 50% who've experienced physical abuse, emotional abuse, etc. So high levels of adversity experienced by these children. By the way, in the intervention, it is not a therapeutic intervention. We actually trained 17, 18, 19, and 20-year-old YMCA camp counselors how to do and how to nurture hope. They received a 2-hour training, significantly less than what you are getting today. We measured hope before the intervention, after the last day of the intervention, and then a 30-day follow-up. So this is literally youth setting goals each day of the activities that they want to engage in. And here is the significant increase in hope from just implementing goal setting and pathways discussion for those youth. So we see a significant increase in hope. There are two things that I want you to think about with this graph. First is this pre-test score, the average score of a 25.38. That represents the slight hope category. So these are the high percentage of C's, D's, F's, high rate of depression and suicidal ideation. And that after the week of goal setting and pathways development at a YMCA camp, we see a significant increase in hope. But what I want to point out is that this 2-point increase in hope is not taking youth from low hope to high hope. It is taking them from slight hope to slightly higher hope. They're still in that slight hope category. So the program moved the needle. Okay, it didn't solve the problem, it moved the needle. But we tracked these youth for a full year. And what we found is that this 2-point increase in hope predicted a letter grade change in the classroom for these high trauma children. That's the power of hope. Hope is not the outcome, it's the process. And we have to remember all we need to do is start to move the needle, and we will see significant improvements in outcome. So we know how to do this process. We know how to nurture hope. And it starts with, you can do these in 20-minute segments. For instance, just introducing the concept of hope, its 3 core components, and distinguishing hoping from wishing. And then it is literally engaging in goal setting, pathways development as an intentional process. So I'm going to show you about 3 or 4 more slides, and then I'll wrap up. I'll actually go through these final slides fairly quickly. But we know that nurturing hope has significant and profound positive impact in children and families' lives. But over the last 3 or 4 years, I've also focused this work on individuals like yourselves who are doing the hard work day in and day out. And so I've been really focusing on how we nurture hope among individuals who are exposed to the trauma and adversity of others on a daily basis. So what we look at is, for instance, hope as it relates to adult well-being. So what we look at is how does hope and resilience promote well-being among adults? And a solid line means that it's statistically significant, and a dashed line means that it is no longer statistically significant. And what we found, and by the way, in every single study that we've done, we find this same outcome, is that hope is the better predictor of staff members or volunteers' well-being. So we know that nurturing hope is a better predictor of well-being. So we can see, for instance, that low, slight, moderate, and high hope among adults has a significant association with the ability to manage workload. So that we can see that moderate and high hope are better able to cope with daily related stress. What I want to highlight here is not so much these numbers, but I want you to see, for instance, when we literally move the needle on hope, when we literally just begin the process of goal setting and pathways development, when people transition from low to slight hope, what I want you to see is the significant and profound reduction in burnout. And at each step along the way that we nurture hope, positive outcomes continue. Here's what I'm trying to communicate, is you don't have to take people or yourself from low hope to high hope. You just have to start the journey. And as you start the journey, positive outcomes follow. We also see then that nurturing hope actually reduces turnover, within volunteers and within staff of organization. Again, just another example of the stair step kind of visual, that when we nurture hope, retention improves of staff and volunteers. We see that when we nurture hope, individuals have much higher rates of personal goal attainment. But this is the one that I want you to really think about, that as a unified organization like CASA with a common mission and a common vision, that it actually promotes this opportunity for collective hope among the advocates. And that actually, by the way, is the significant predictor of the organization's level of effectiveness. And then finally, this will be the last graph I show, but it very similar to burnout. What we see is that just transitioning from low hope to slight hope, again, moving the needle, produces profound improvements in well-being. So this is what I'm trying to communicate. Number one, hope is one of the best predictors of our capacity to thrive for children, for adults, and for families. But what I want you to think about is the idea that hope is a mindset, and that you don't have to climb the whole mountain. You don't have to solve the whole problem. You don't have to go from low to high hope. You literally just have to begin the journey, and significant positive outcomes will follow. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my PowerPoint slide. I'm going to invite us to take a 10-minute break. So I've got roughly 10:20 your time. And so at 10:30, we'll come back. And what I'm going to do is give a little bit of time for some Q&A just to clarify. And then we'll transition into a very interactive strategy of how you actually do hope work, so that you'll see that process before this workshop is finished. Okay, so 10-minute break, and we'll come back after that. So thank you.